You're not going to be able to deny it after this. So it's going to be over. This is it. It's game. This is game. So let's get into this book. Okay, now, first thing I want to talk about is the contradictions. Because as soon as you open a book, boom, contradictions, problems, mistakes, errors, issues in the beginning of the book. There's no way you can read Genesis chapter 1 through chapter 5 and summarize it and tell me that this is some truth. Because there's too many problems. Too many problems right off the bat. Now, before I get into that, I want to reveal to you the first major clue of the Bible. Now, the first thing is, every major story in the book, every major story in the Bible has two different stories. That's the first clue. It's two stories to everything. Two major stories. And then there's the parable. The parable itself of the two major stories. Now this shit is scattered all over the book. It's scattered in different verses. So like you go Matthew and you read, right? Then you get to John, which is the fourth gospel. And it's like something in John that goes all the way back to Matthew. But if you don't know this, there's no way you can figure this out unless you study the book. Now, if you're somebody taking the book literally, there's no way you're going to ever know this. You have to spend over 14 years doing this. A lot of people spend a lot of time doing this. It's something you really have to do. But I'm going to be honest with you. If you just read it, you can figure it out. So if you read it and you read Matthew and you keep in mind what you just read, you know, if you got a good memory, that's why the Bible was written to confuse you. It's written in gibberish. That's why he said to the Jews, a stumbling block. This is what Paul was talking about. To the Jews, a stumbling block, you know, and to the Greeks, foolishness. But it's because it's written in that way to deceive you. So the first major clue is it's different stories, and it's apparent as soon as you get to Genesis. So let's get into Genesis and see what this whole thing I'm talking about is. Okay, so starting at Genesis chapter 1, verse 5, we're going to start there. It's going to start off like small contradictions, but then it's going to get outrageous, humongous contradictions. So let's start. Verse 5, it says, and God called the light day, and the darkness he called night, and the evening and the morning was the first day. So my question is, how can he do that when he didn't create the sun and the moon until verse 16, which says, and God made two great lights, the greater light, which is the sun, to rule the day, the lesser light to rule the night, which is the moon. He made the stars also. Okay, so my question was, how in the world can he call the day, the light day? We attribute the day to the sun being out. So if the sun wasn't created until later on, how is he calling it day? So, of course, some Christians will say, oh, well, he said, let it be light. So God made this, you know, symbolic light appear when, I mean, common sense is like, huh? Common sense, light comes from the sun. So if you didn't make the sun till later on, how was you calling it day and how was you calling it night when there's no sun or moon? Okay, so small contradiction, we can say that. But to me, it's a flaw. It's a flaw, and it's something that somebody who is writing this gospel should explain. How is that possible when common sense should tell you you can't have no day without a sun, can't have no night without a moon. But let's keep going. Genesis 1:20, it says, and God said, let the waters bring forth abundantly the moving creatures that have life, and fowls that may fly above the earth in the open firmament of heaven. Okay, so it says here that the fowls came from the waters. But Genesis 2:19 says, and out of the ground the Lord formed every beast of the field and every fowl of the air. I can stop there. Now, every fowl of the air. How is that possible when it just said earlier in Genesis 1:20 that from the waters, the fowls came from the waters? So another small contradiction, but to me, it's a flaw. So for people who thinking this is the, you know, the uncorruptible, you know, inspired, all the blah, blah, blah crap people say about the Bible, you know, it's the word of God, it's flawless, obvious flaws, as soon as you open the book. Let's keep going though. Now, Genesis 1:26, this is where it starts getting good. And God said, let us make man in our image after our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the fowl of the air, and over the cattle, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creepeth upon the earth. So God created man in his own image. In the image of God created he him, male and female created he them. And God blessed them, and God said unto them, be fruitful and multiply and replenish. That is a major thing right there. Replenish. Means to do again. Replenish the earth and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the fowl of the air, and over every living thing that moves upon earth. So it's saying God made man and woman in his own image. Male and female created he them in our image. So when you go to and you look at Genesis 2:7, it says, and the Lord God formed man of the dust of the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and man became a living soul. So it's the image of God dirt. Not to mention the fact that there was men and women created before Adam and Eve, as it says in Genesis 1:27. That is clue, big clue. So big contradiction as well. How is it? Because this is what I've heard from Christians. Christians say, well, no. They say that the first book of Genesis is just a summary of Genesis, just a summary of the creation story. And, chapter 2 is more in detail. That's the difference. But there's contradictions. So it can't be a summary when you got contradictions, especially when it says he made, the fowls and everything from the water. And then it says here he made it from the ground. That's a contradiction. That's two separate stories, two different stories. That's not the same story. That's two different things. So then, it's talking about the creation story. When you create it, first you create Adam and Eve. You create man and woman from your own likeness, it says. And you told them to go, be fruitful and multiply. Go. Go replenish the earth. Go be fruitful. But we know when you start getting into Genesis chapter 2, he puts them in the garden. So it's like, well, wait a minute. I thought he said go be fruitful and, go replenish the earth and multiply and all this and that. But here he's putting them in the garden, and woman is created again from the rib of Adam. But you just created woman in your image before in chapter 1. So how can it be in more detail? It doesn't make sense when you made him in your image and here you made her from a rib. Nah, we can common sense to tell you that this is two separate stories. So we're going to get into exactly what it is when you start looking at chapter 4. Because we go to chapter 4, we know the whole Cain and Abel thing happens. But Genesis 4:14, Cain finds a wife in the land of Nod. Who was she? So this woman, whoever she was, destroys that whole theory of it was a summary. And then it was explained in more details in chapter 2. That this destroys it. Because if that's the case, who was Cain's wife? Where did she come from? Because if it's just a summary and those other people wasn't created, the people who he said we created in our own image, poof, go out, go be fruitful and multiply, then you go and create Adam and Eve. If that's not true, then it's Adam, Eve, Cain, Abel. That's it. That's 4 people. Then we know Cain kills Abel. It's 3 people left. Who is this woman? Who is she? So now when we go to and we look at Genesis 4:14, when it's talking about him throwing Cain out for killing Abel, it says, behold, thou hast driven me out this day from the face of the earth, and from thy face shall I be hid, and I shall be a fugitive and a vagabond in the earth. And it shall come to pass that everyone that findeth me shall slay me. What is he talking about? What is he talking about? Who is he talking about? If it's just supposed to be Adam and Eve, Cain and Abel, who is he talking about? So, like I said, it destroys that whole thing. Now, let me explain this to you. First, Genesis chapter 1. Start from chapter 1, verse 1, all the way up to Genesis chapter 2, verse 3. That's one story. That's one story. I told you, it's 2 stories for every major story. So, and they're separate, they're different. That's one story. Now, the second story starts at Genesis 2:4 to Genesis 5. That's where it stops. Two different stories. Now, we know from Genesis 2:4 and on, we get into Adam and Eve, the whole Garden of Eden and all this and that. But then when you get to Genesis 5:1, it doesn't talk about none of that. It doesn't even talk about Eve at all. It doesn't talk about Cain and Abel. 5:1 picks up where 2:3 left off, the first story left off. So notice Genesis 5:1 says, this is the book of the generations of Adam. Not Eve, not Adam and Eve, Adam. And the day that God created man in the likeness of God made he him. Male and female created he them, and blessed them, and called their name Adam. Huh? What is he talking about? There's no mention of Eve. No mention of Eve at all. He said called their name Adam. I'm going to explain this later, and it's going to make a lot of sense. I'm going to explain this. Now, in the day when they were created, and Adam lived 130 years. And now it's telling you when Adam died, and then it says, and begot a son in his own likeness after his image, and called his name Seth. What? Seth? Who the hell is Seth? We know that Cain and Abel. It doesn't speak about Cain and Abel in 5. Now, if you go back to 4 ends off with a whole genealogy. And it's listing he begot, whatever. Now, here in 5, it gives you a genealogy again. But Cain and Abel is not in here. It's not talking about Cain and Abel. It's a whole different genealogy starting with Seth. This is a completely different story. As I said, it's two different stories for every major event. There's no way if you don't study this book, you'll never figure that out. If you're going to go to church and sit down and let a man tell you what's in this book, guess what? You're going to believe what that man is telling you. But if you actually read the book and study the book, there's no way you cannot figure this out. It's two separate stories right here in your face. Now, it said, and Seth lived 105 years and begot Enos. Now, it's not saying nothing about Eve. What happened to Eve? When did she die? It doesn't say anything about Eve. Doesn't say anything. And this is just the opening of the book from the 1 to 5, the first 5 chapters, and we got all these issues, all these problems. But you're going to sit there and tell me that this is the word of the Creator, of God. Come on, people. But let's keep going.